The Russian President Vladimir Putin has thanked the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un for providing troops to help Russia fight Ukraine. Hours earlier, Pyongyang admitted for the first time it had deployed soldiers to the conflict. It said it helped, in its words, to liberate the Russian region of Kursk. President Putin said Russia would never forget the North Koreans who lost their lives paying tribute to what he called their heroism. Western officials believe at least 1,000 North Korean soldiers have been killed in Ukraine. This comes as President Trump tells reporters he is disappointed by Russia's continuing attacks on Ukraine. He again criticised Vladimir Putin, telling him to sign a ceasefire and stop the shooting. Donald Trump said he thought Ukraine's leader was willing to give up Crimea in return for peace. The peninsula was illegally annexed by Russia 11 years ago. Let's talk to our correspondent John Donnison, who's in Kyiv. And John, on the role of North Korea, this is the first time that Pyongyang has acknowledged its part in the war.
Yeah, I mean, for some time now, Western intelligence officials have suggested that there were up to 10,000 North Korean troops fighting alongside the Russians in the Kursk region. Up until now, both Russia and North Korea have remained silent on this issue, but today, for the first time, North Korea has come out and acknowledged that is the case. President Putin has thanked them for their heroism, and it's thought some 1,000 North Korean troops have been killed during those operations, which, as you say, the North Koreans and the Russians have called efforts to liberate the Kursk region from Ukraine. So nothing really that we didn't know was happening or suspect was happening, but interesting that they've chosen to acknowledge it at this moment.
And to the war more widely, we've heard quite a bit in recent days about a scenario in which Ukraine agrees to give up control of Crimea and acknowledge Russia owns Crimea as part of some kind of ceasefire agreement. But what is Ukraine saying about that prospect?
Well, we've heard that from the Americans. That's what Donald Trump has suggested might happen, and under this American plan, which has been presented to both the Russians and the Ukrainians, America would officially recognize Russian control over Crimea. But we've certainly not heard the Ukrainians say that they're ready to accept that. In fact, President Zelensky has said that is something he is not able to do. It is against the Ukrainian constitution. It might require a referendum. He doesn't have the mandate to do that. And what the Ukrainian leader has said is that before there can be any discussions about territory, we have to have a ceasefire, a complete unconditional ceasefire, which is something the Americans were pushing for as well, and something that Moscow has rejected. So look, I do think that there is an acceptance amongst many Ukrainians that they will have to cede some territory to the Russians, potentially on a sort of temporary basis, maybe with the final status of those territories to be negotiated further down the line. But they've certainly not said that they're ready to just give up Crimea before we even get to the ceasefire stage.
Where are we with ceasefire talks? Because on the weekend we saw those incredible pictures of Presidents Trump and Zelensky sitting face to face at the Pope's funeral on the sidelines in those chairs. Has that kind of ignited hopes that something might be achieved quite soon?
Well, I think definitely that was a positive sign, especially for Ukrainians, that those amazing pictures of the two men, their heads together, chewing things over, a far cry from the slanging match that the two presidents had at the Oval Office back in February. But as to where we are with the talks, I mean, who knows, frankly? Discussions are still ongoing, but President Trump seems to say a different thing every day. You know, one minute he's praising Vladimir Putin and blaming everything on the Ukrainian leader, Volodymyr Zelensky, saying he finds the Ukrainian leader more difficult to deal with than President Putin. The next day, he's criticizing President Putin for continued civilian attacks on civilians in Ukraine, and saying that the Russian leader might just be tapping him along. So it's very difficult to know where we are, but certainly in terms of their public statements, you don't feel that a deal is in the offing.
John, thank you. John Donnison in Kyiv.